Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. In today's archive video we have esteemed astrologer Donna Woodwell presenting the art of astrological talismans. As a reminder, coming up on January 29th we have a 5 weeks beginners course in astrological magic presented by Michael Offek. If you'd like to learn more, please see the link below this video in the description, and keep an eye out for an interview with Michael next week as we dive deeper into astrological magic. We've had a couple of delays. I don't know about you guys, but I'm ready for Mars and Mercury to turn direct and get 2023 into the swing of things. And of course, we always love to read your comments. So please let us know how your 2023 is going so far. And without further ado, let's get into the video.
Welcome to this presentation, The Art of Astrological Talismans, what every astrologer once knew how to do. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about this today because I think this is one of those topics that we have skipped over in the very recent years in modern astrology that used to be so embedded in traditional astrology. You did not learn astrology without learning how to make talismans. You may not have been making them, but you certainly knew the concept. And it does help expand and give richness and depth to your astrological practice. So what we're going to be talking about today is to give you a very basic understanding of why and how to make astrological talismans. So in order to do that, I need to give you a little bit of a brief history of magic in general, so you know the theory that they were using to put together these talismans. After that, we're going to talk about how to make talismans themselves so that you can make your own if you would care to do so. And then finally, to finish up with a few ideas on when might be an appropriate time to make a talisman. Now, to talk about magic, we first have to get an idea of the worldview that gave birth to the idea of magic in the first place. Now, magic assumes that there is some kind of metaphysical reality of which we are embedded as a part. That the idea that we are 3 dimensions, everything that you can kick, is all there is, doesn't make sense if you're going to start talking about magic. And as astrologers, we're pretty used to the idea that there's more than just 3-dimensional stuff in the world. Modern science is starting to talk about this again as a sacred or a vertical dimension, in which we are all part in acting. There's 2 general philosophies that involve this notion, one of which has been called dualism, and that's the idea that there's a metaphysical reality or a spiritual reality that is running parallel to a physical reality, that there's mind and a matter field. There's also a kind of metaphysical monism, and that's the idea that there is a metaphysical, a deeper reality of which our stuff of life is really just a special case of, kind of like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles, but rectangles aren't squares. Same kind of idea, that here is just a dense, slow form of spirit. And that's a little picture from the movie Flatland. Flatland was a book from the later part of the 19th century that talked about, it was an allegory for society in England, but it had the concept that there was a 2-dimensional world into which a 3-dimensional creature appeared, and the antics that ensued because of that encounter, and the enlightening experience when you try as a 2-dimensional creature to apprehend a 3-dimensional concept. Same kind of idea with what we're talking about with magic. This magician's paradigm, they were struggling with the idea, especially all of the Western world, but really this applies to all different cultures, of this philosophical conundrum. Let's say that at one point in time we were all one. Everything was one. How in the world do we move from this inherent state of oneness, of unity, to this incredible diversity that we see and experience in our physical realities? And the way they attempted to describe this process has been called by later scholars a theory of emanation. How one could outflow into various forms in order to create from one all the way to the many. So cultures from Egypt and Babylon and Greece, and you may be familiar with a Jewish version called the Kabbalah. It's another map of this process. Early Christianity all had their own versions, these maps of how we get from a divine unity, a oneness, into a physical incarnation. That process of creation is what we're talking about when we start talking about magic, because we're interested in how to duplicate it. If the gods could create all of this diversity. Maybe if we become more godlike, we can duplicate their process and also create something in reality. Okay, so one of the early models that we have as a written record is what Plotinus, who was a Neoplatonist who was writing in about the 2nd century AD or BCE, well, no, CE, I guess they call it the Common Era. So it's either AD or the Common Era, depending on how you put it. Plotinus was an early Neoplatonist. He was inspired by the Platonic doctrines. We all are familiar with Plato of ancient Greece. But he had a teacher who was in the Hermetic tradition out of Alexandria in Egypt. And he was putting together all of the learnings that he had from his Hermetic teacher into one of the most compelling metaphysical discussions that we have of the Neoplatonic age. And his map of reality was a summary of what he had learned, and it goes something like this, that we all start with the one, the all, however, the divine, the Godhead, however you want to put it. In Greek, it's called 2N. And from there, that one outflowed itself into a world of divine intellects, also the world of forms in the Platonic sense, called nous. It's where we get the word for noetic science, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, if you're familiar with that. From that divine intellect, we had another outflowing into reality called psyche. It's where we get the word psyche or psychology from, and it means soul, desire, and movement. You may be familiar with the term daimon. Daimon is like a guardian angel or a tutelary spirit, a guiding spirit, of which was associated with the realm of the planets as well. And so from there, this soul outflows again into all of nature, called phusis. And phusis is built on the substructure of what's called hule, which is kind of the prime material, the ultimate receptivity. And so there's this idea that this divine intellect creates a pattern that moves down and adds soul and desire to itself, and that creates reality. And that having this philosophical model in mind gave them the ability to perhaps repeat it in a microcosm form here in a 3D world. Now, modern people have talked about this as the sense of turtles all the way down. It's actually a reference to the idea that some cultures had that the entire, all of creation was a flat tableau that was riding around on the back of the turtle. This idea of infinite regression. But that turtles all the way down is kind of the same thing they were trying to get at, that each level reflects the level above it. It takes on the qualities of it all the way down to the bottom. Okay? So getting back to that Platonic worldview, Plato, and you may be familiar with him, wrote a lot of famous books back in the ancient Greek era, one of which was called the Republic. And in the Republic, he talks about the allegory of the cave. Now, the allegory of the cave is the idea that we are all in a dark cave, and there's something behind us that is shining a light through and casting shadows on the wall, and that those shadows on the wall, when we are not enlightened, when we are stuck in our cave mind, we think that those shadows on the wall are reality. But in essence, the reality starts with what is the light behind, which then shines on some object that produces the shadows. And he talked about this as the difference between the world of forms and the world of matter. And the world of forms were the pattern, the template, the thing that caused the shadows. And the stuff on the wall was simply the world of matter. And this formalism, is called, was the idea that everything that exists in a higher place, on a higher dimension, but it creates the pattern for what's happening down here. Okay? This is actually the deeper meaning of the concept of as above, so below. We like to talk about in astrology that somehow as above means as in the planetary realm, so below is what happens on Earth. But there's actually a deeper meaning than that. And the deeper meaning is that as it happens in the mind of God, as it happens in the spiritual realm, so it will happen on Earth. And so Hermetic magic is based in part on the idea that if you understand the correspondences between the different levels of reality, If you understand the correspondences between those formal causes and what's happening down here in the physical world, you can tweak the formal causes in order to shift the way reality comes out. And this is where astrology comes into play. Okay, so magic defined. Here, I'm going to give you my definition of magic, just to get us the ball started. There are multiple definitions of magic, but in this presentation, we're going to think of it in terms of something that changes or causes material, psychological, or spiritual events through the use of metaphysical means, such as sympathetic resonances between natural objects, the intervention of spiritual beings, or the action of human desire, sexuality, or focused emotion. In the course of this presentation, we're going to go all over what each one of those things means. But for now, let's just think about it as something that causes material or psychological or spiritual change using metaphysical action, the action on that vertical dimension. Okay? In the ancient Greek world, we talked about two forms of magic. There's theurgy, which literally defined as God work, which is like spiritual magic that is used to unite humans with the divine in order to gain wisdom, understanding, or to be of service to the whole. In essence, this is magic in order to help you become enlightened. And there's a second form of magic called thaumaturgy, which in Greek translates as wonder-working. But this is really the practical or mundane magic in order to gain mundane power, wealth, love, sex, anything else that we like to have on this 3D world of ours, using those same magical abilities to create those effects in our world. Okay? Now, this Western magical legacy, of which we are all a part, extends all the way back from the time of the Egyptians. This is where we have records. It probably goes back even further in the shamanic, indigenous practices of our pre-written cultures, because in all of the indigenous practices around the world, there is some form of this. We may define it in slightly different words, but the essence is the same. So, but in our Western world, it starts with the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, and the Indian cultures, because all of these cultures were talking and sharing and trading back and forth. The Greeks and the Romans took this on and had their own versions. There was actually a very intense practice of magic in the late classical period in Rome. There's a lot of things written about it. This went directly into the Arabic culture and eventually filtered down into medieval and Renaissance Europe. Ian had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation there was another Renaissance during the Renaissance of magical practice. By the Middle Ages, there was this concept of these flavors of magic. There was natural magic. This is with the influence of the Christian church, what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. Natural magic was magic that relied on the correspondences between natural objects, like rocks and stones and planets, in order to create certain effects. That was legitimate. But when you started talking about conjuring spirits, or in order to impel them to create some kind of magical act. Now, whether that be the spirits of the dead, the spirits of animals, the spirits of demons, all of that fell into the category of necromancy, or negromancy, which got translated as black magic. And that was not permitted in the Christian church. That would get you in trouble and burned at the stake. Okay? So let's talk about what a talisman is. A talisman is really a sacred enclosure. It's a physical object that lets you attract in the rays, quote, of some kind of celestial influence or divine influence in order to help build a bridge between the three-dimensional world and that kind of an influence. One of my favorite authors used the term magical decoy. I think it's a great word, because a decoy is, in a sense, when you use a decoy for hunting, you put it out there like it looks like a little duck, sails out in order to attract. It looks like a duck. It's like a duck. You just remember those words, like a, because all this theory of correspondence works on the idea of resonance, and resonance is such and such is like such and such. Okay? So you send out a duck that is like the ducks that are flying around in the sky to attract the ducks down, and of course in the allegory of hunting you actually shoot them and you can take them home with you. And we hope you're not actually shooting the spirits that are involved in this practice. But it's the same kind of idea, that by creating something that is like something else, that you can resonate with the influence of that and then work with it in a creative way. Okay? So here are some quotes. In other words, here's a quote from Israel Regardie, who was a part of the Golden Dawn. We will talk about that in a little bit. It's a magical order that grew up around the turn of the 20th century. In other words, it's a magical figure. A talisman is a magical figure charged with the force that is intended to represent. In the construction of the talisman, care should be taken to make it, as far as possible, to represent the universal forces, so it's in harmony with those forces you wish to attract. The more exact the symbolism, the more easily it is to attract the force. Other things coinciding, such as the consecration at the right time. You hear consecration at the right time, you should hear astrology in this mix. Astrology has always been a part of the magical tradition because it is the art of choosing the right time. Little side note here. There is a big difference between attraction and containment. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the movie Ghostbusters, when they go out with their little gadgets and attract to contain the spiritual forces. And that was also a part of the Western tradition, but it isn't so much in some of the shamanic traditions. And the shamanic traditions tended to rely more on the working with your allies, working with your spiritual allies, your totem allies, your planetary allies, your rock friends, your herbal allies, in a collective harmony to make change happen in the world. Okay? It wasn't so much about the force and, you know, chaining demons to a rock in order to get them to do their bidding. And I come out of a shamanic tradition myself. One of my teachers lived with a Lakota tribe for a very long time, married into the tribe, and that's kind of an anathema to my way of thinking about things. It's kind of like making slaves out of the astral realms. It seems kind of unfair. I also tend to think of them as bigger than me, and so if they like to help me, it's because they're entertained by that fact, rather than just because I force them to do something. It's kind of like forcing the elephant to do your bidding. The elephant does what it wants to do at the end of the day. It acts like an elephant. But it's something to think about as you are putting together your own practice, that there is a difference between attraction and containment, and your moral and standards level will determine how you navigate that. So where does astral magic fit? Astral magic, here's a quote from Owen Davies in his book Grimoires, which I recommend if you're interested in history of magic. Astral magic is based on the notion that the powers emanating from the planets, that the rays of the planets and the stars can be channeled into talismans and images through the agency of the spirits that are associated with those planets at the appropriate moments. Now, they also use prayers and offerings to thank the planets for their participation. Just like you have in any friendship, if you ask your friend to do something for you, it's nice to say thank you to your friend after they have helped you out. You know, if they're going to help you clean your garage, you get out the beer and pizza. Same kind of thing when you're working with the spiritual realm. If you're gonna ask Jupiter to help you out with something, or Mercury to help you out with something, well, you thank them by going and getting their favorite things as a way to say, hey, thank you for paying attention to me and helping me with my little issue here. And they say, no problem, we like you and we like working with your issue. Then there's happy balance in the realm. So astromagical texts, if you want to continue to go and look more into this topic when this presentation is done, and I always highly recommend this to people. My presentations, you know, when you have an hour and a half, the best you can make is an introduction to get people excited and knowing where they can look for more information. So when you want to start looking for more information, some of the most notable magical texts of the Middle Ages, where a lot of the Middle-Aged and Renaissance magic comes from. And it's a great starting place because the texts from the Middle Ages are new enough that they're accessible to us, but they're old enough they were taking all of the materials that have been given to them and collecting them like an encyclopedia of knowledge. One of the probably the major one is the Picatrix. It was just released relatively recently in a new translation by Christopher Warnock, and which I highly recommend. In fact, I have my own personal story to go with the Picatrix. I actually got my copy when I was getting on a plane to fly to Chicago in, I believe, 2012. in order to give a presentation on the Venus transit. And I was flipping through the book, looking up all the stuff on Venus just to see if it had anything to do with my presentation. And they had a talisman instructions. There's recipes for all kinds of talismans based on their astrology in the Picatrix. And it said, create a waxen figure and bury it in the yard of the person you want to attract, and blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, really, I wonder if this actually works. And then the flight attendant leaned over and said, hey, excuse me, ma'am. And I said, hello, yes? And she handed me a piece of paper, and she said, there's a gentleman a few rows back who says he dated you in college. And I went, what? And I looked at the card that she'd given me, and it took my brain a moment to recognize that, hey, that really was the guy I dated in college. So I turned around, and there he was, right behind me, waving. So magic happens, even at 35,000 feet, somewhere over the rainbow, or maybe Kansas in this state, when magic is all about those correspondences, those moments of synchronicity that happen between me flying to give a presentation on Venus, the love goddess, with Picatrix on my lap, reading about the love goddess, getting thrown back during a Venus retrograde into having my ex-boyfriend on the plane. So those are magical moments, and that's what things like the Picatrix and some of these other books, the Coranities and the Heptameron, are all about recreating those by observing the cycles that are around us and then living with them and sort of encouraging them to happen. Okay, going a little further then into the Renaissance age, as Enid mentioned, there was a new flourishing of interest in talismans around this point in time. Some of the major astral magicians, Marsilio Ficino, he wrote a book called 3 Books on Life. He was actually a translator of Greek texts that had just been re-imported into the Western world. Long story that goes behind that. If you're interested in these kinds of things, and we're going to tell them all in our class on Renaissance alchemy and magic that's coming up in a few weeks. But Marsilio Ficino wrote about ways that you could use natural magic to make talismans and things in order to work with the planets. Johannes Trimethius, fascinating guy. We don't really talk about it a lot in astrology, but he has a book called the Scenographia, and it contains planetary invocations for all of the planets. He was actually more well known for the fact that he was an early cryptographer. He studied codes and how codes work, but he was also a very avid astrologer. So he's a really fascinating character. I'm looking forward to getting more into him. And of course, Cornelius Agrippa wrote 3 books on occult philosophy, dozens of, there's this voluminous information that he collected over the years from various different sources, also many different kinds of astrological talismans he talks about making. So these are, of course, 3 books that you might want to check out, also if you're interested in learning more about astral magic. Francis Yates, who was a scholar of magic and other hermetic disciplines, studied out of the Warburg Institute. If you don't know about the Warburg Institute, it's like my personal concept of nirvana. Large libraries of esoteric studies, probably one of the largest esoteric studies library in the world. It is in London. Excuse me. She writes in one of her books that Ficino's magic, which Agrippa teaches in his first book, Agrippa takes it much further. Just like every generation sees what the generation before it is doing and then pushes the boundaries a little bit further, that's exactly what happened between Ficino and Agrippa. That Ficino was more concerned with keeping his magic natural, in the sense that he wanted to work with natural cycles, but not upset the apple cart nor the Catholic Church. Marsilio Ficino actually became a Catholic priest later in his career, and he was very much trying to stay within his Orthodox tradition. Agrippa pushed it, he didn't want to upset the star demons. I love that term, the star demons, the spirits of the different planetary intelligences. Yeah, Agrippa was like, oh, hey, you can't avoid the star demons anyway, so hey, let's just work with them, and took it an even step farther. So coming down into the modern age, what happened to magic? Well, this concept of correspondences, that each one of the planets had their own collection of things, their favorite things that they like to work with, continue to be used even past the Renaissance. Some people you might be familiar with, Nicholas Culpeper. He was an early advocate of popular medicine. He believed medicine shouldn't be just for the rich, it should be accessible to everybody. And he also had clinics that served the poor as well as the wealthy. And he's really important to how our medical practice developed in the West. But he also had an extensive use of herbalism and used planetary correspondences between different planets and different herbs in order to treat ailments. So let's say for example, someone had a fever. They had an excess of Mars because Mars heats things up and it inflames things. So he would treat them with Mars-related herbs or the counterbalance to cool down the Mars effects. And that's how medicine was created. So he was also actively using those systems of correspondences. William Lilly, who wrote Christian astrology, did horary astrology, had an extensive use of planetary stones and things and how they related to different planets in order to help create effects here on Earth. Farmer's Almanac is another great example of correspondence medicine. You plant during certain times. If you want different kinds of plants to thrive, you pick the moon aspects at the very least during which they're going to promote growth or keep growth under control depending on what you are trying to accomplish with the plant. Plants that grow underground you plant at one time versus plants that need to sprout above ground. So the Farmer's Almanac was still using these kinds of things, and that was 17th, 18th centuries. Since the discovery of the outer planets, we have also tried to imagine how they might fit into the whole picture. We're going to talk about outer planets in a little bit more detail when we talk about actually constructing talismans. But we have attempted to figure out how that might fit into the picture. Okay? Why haven't we read about this? So if you're listening in and you have been studying astrology for a while and you haven't come across this concept of a theory of emanations and how this fit into magic, it is simply because in the post-scientific revolution era, we've removed a lot of the conversation about magic from astrology proper. We've tended to try to look at astrology either from a scientific perspective, it's an art or a science, the scientific perspective to find ways to study weather or something else to make it acceptable to a scientific audience, and that especially in the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th centuries, in that moments in time trying to figure out how astrology can be saved from the scientific revolution, so to speak. Eventually we turned into a humanistic or psychological perspective where astrology became something that was more about archetypes and the psychology inside of you and less about the stuff that was happening in the material world. And that's where a lot of our modern astrology comes from. So things that you might have picked up in the last, that were written in the last 20, 30, 40 years tend to de-emphasize the magical part of our astrological tradition. Now, some elements of theurgical magic survived in esoteric astrology from people like Alice Bailey. Have little snippets of it here and there. And also the thaumaturgy side, the actual mundane magic. You're going to see a lot of that in Hermetic magical practices. Orders like the Golden Dawn have used it all the time. But also in things like alchemy, because alchemy, in essence, is another way of using the planetary archetypes, the planetary spirits, in a slightly different context of how metals evolve and is a reflection of how people evolve. But each one of the metals have their own planetary correspondence, and so it becomes this infusion of astrology and chemistry in a really interesting kind of way. And that's why we're going to be focusing on that in the presentations coming up in a few weeks. So if you haven't read about it, it's just you can actually tell on what people have been influenced by when they're studying their astrology of how much magical practice they've got. People who are pagans who listen to me, or people who are Wiccans, and we talk about it all the time, I actually start speaking to them like, I had no idea that that was in astrology. And that's kind of the same reaction I had. I started my astrological practice already having been studying shamanism. And so I kept, when I read astrology for the first time, the first books I read, I said, why isn't any of the shamanic stuff in the astrology that I'm reading about? It feels like something's missing. And for me, part of that journey was going backwards in time. I was fortunate enough to have several people around me saying, hey, my Hermetic teacher says you're not going to find what you're looking for in astrology at least until you at least go back a few thousand years, because it's just not there anymore. And my friend Maria Matus, who used to live down the street, she recommended the Chaldean oracles. She was a student at Kepler getting her master's degree, and I picked up the Chaldean oracles, and for the first time I went, oh my God, I know what this feels like. It was describing the sensation of what we call channeling these days, but aspecting with one of the divine spirits of the planets as it settled down in and sat on your throat and then moved into your chest, and you became the voice of the planet. Anyone familiar with the concept of drawing down the moon in the pagan Wiccan experience is going to know what this sounds like. Well, they were describing it 2,000 years ago in the Chaldean oracles, almost verbatim. And I went, oh my goodness, here is the bridge that I was missing to bring back this other side of astrology. It's never been gone. We just haven't talked about it so much in recent years. Okay? So this gets me into how to make talismans. Now, anybody who's tuning in who is looking for a purist traditional explanation, I'm really sorry, that's not me. Because I'm a modern girl living in a modern age, and because I learned some of this first in a shamanic tradition that's a living tradition, I had ways of working with different spiritual elements that are based on my personal experience. And I have absolute gratitude for people who are going and recovering the original traditional methods that were outlined in the Picatrix or other texts at the time for how to make talismans. It's a great historical boon that we can get this stuff back. And of course it works. But once you understand the heart of what's being done, there are other things that work too, because it's the same stuff. It's just, let's say back in, you don't need to go out and get, you know, virgin cured parchment made out of newborn lambs on the new moon in order to accomplish this something similar if you understand the basic principles. And so that's what I want to get you here, is some concept of the basic principles so that you can experiment on your own. At the end of the day, this really is a grand experiment. There's no one way to do magic, and there's no one way to make talismans either. So I have broken it down for you into 5 steps for making a talisman. I have done more research on this and reading and practicing, and for me, this is like the little checklist that I run down in my Virgo head, and you know how us Virgo heads like our little checklist. So the first thing you need to do is to determine your intention. If you're going to make a talisman, you better know why you're making it. Okay. Second thing you're going to need to do is choose who you are going to work with the different planets, and we're going to tell you how to do that. You're going to choose a time, and this is where electional astrology, you cannot separate astral magic or talisman making from electional astrology. You get really good at electional astrology if you start to bring magic back into the equation, for obvious reasons. Then you're going to gather your ingredients, and then you're going to assemble them and consecrate them at the designated time, and poof, you have a talisman. So let's look at these each individually. So first thing you're going to do is determine your intention. Now, if you're going to try to affect change in a 3-dimensional world, the power of intention is what sets the whole thing in motion. And we're not talking about intention as in setting an intention and just repeating to yourself ad nauseum, you know, I will make $1 million, I will make $1 million, I will make $1 million. That's not quite what we mean when we mean intention. That's just you having an affirmation that you say over and again. And intention is something deeper than that. It's something that goes all the way down into that spiritual or vertical dimension, goes deeper and higher depending on which kind of metaphor that you want to use. And so it's got to be really clear and simple and concise, because the parts of us that exist on those dimensions, they do not think in words the way we do in our little 3-dimensional reality. We think in a place beyond words, and information comes instantaneously, and it comes in images. It's called chunking. It's a whole big thing of information simultaneously. And so you need to be really clear and really concise. And along the same vein, it means not asking for more than one thing at a time. Because this is, if you're trying to get the message across and down, and you create something that attracts change, because what we're doing is creating something that attracts change to happen in the world. If you ask for a whole bunch of stuff, what you're going to get is confusion, and probably not a lot, as much of a result. Kind of the difference between having your hose attachment set on direct stream and set on spray nozzle. When you have it set on direct stream, something happens. You can like take it to the carnival and shoot it at one of those little balloon blow up things and blow up the balloon and something happens. But if it's set on diffuse spray jet, it sprays all over the place and nothing manifests. And if you, just as an aside, if you actually look at your life and you wonder why nothing manifests the way you want it to, think about how you're spending your energy. And if you're spending a little bit here and a little bit there and a little bit there, and you're constantly ADD, like switching back and forth, you're not giving anything any power. And it's hard to get anything accomplished. Maybe a little bit here, but not nearly as much as if you bring your focus down with a really clear intention. So here are some examples of intentions, but I want you, as you start your magical practice, I think intention is the part that requires the most work, but it also brings the most benefit. Because you have to think about the pros and cons of every kind of intention that you make. Because what you think of as clear may not be so clear when you start working on these elements of working with correspondences and on the planetary planes and all those other things. For example, so let's say you want to attract wealth, okay? Attract wealth, you know, this is just think of it as like the impish genie and how you can interpret the concept of attract wealth. You know, maybe you want to attract wealth, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the lottery. Maybe you get a job in a bank and you're surrounded by wealth all day long. You attracted wealth, but that may not have been exactly what you had in mind. You know, or let's say your intention was to lose weight. Yeah, you can lose weight and be healthy because you got on a diet, or you can lose weight because you got a tapeworm and therefore you got sick and you lost weight, but it was not necessarily the way you had envisioned. Okay? Or for example, here's another great story. When I was studying with my shamanic teacher, her name was Ike West. You can look her up online if you're ever interested. We were sitting in her house in a circle, and we were practicing the art of manifestation. So we had consecrated the circle, and we were working with various spiritual essences. But before we started, we had written out on a piece of paper what we wanted from the world. One of the things on my piece of paper was that I wanted a white truck. I had just moved to Texas, wasn't that long before, and for some reason I had it in my head that if I was going to be a Texan, I was going to get a truck, a baby little white truck, because I don't like big cars. And so I had it on my map, and I went home that night after a couple ceremonies that evening, and in the middle of the night, 3:30, 4 in the morning, there was this banging on our door, and my then husband, I got up and went wandering into the living room. What's going on? Opened the door, and there's our neighbor standing there. He's like, "Are you all right?" And my husband is there going, "What do you mean, huh?" And he says, "Look!" And so we pulled the door back, and there were our two cars that we had parked side by side in the driveway, bashed and mangled up in a big pile thrown across our yard. And someone had jumped the curb in the middle of the night and run into the back of both of our cars. And total mess. In fact, they had to cut a crane to get the two cars apart. But in the morning, I had to go back for the next day of my manifestation class. I had to call one of my class members and say, "Can you come and pick me up on the way to class, because we have nothing to drive?" And so there's a moral of the story. I really wanted that white truck, and guess what? I was getting that white truck because we were going to get settlement checks from the guy who jumped the curb and ran into our cars. But that was not necessarily the way I had intended on getting my little white truck. But there you go. Sometimes intention is everything, and you have to be specific about what you're asking for. Okay? The moral of the story. So, part 2, choosing your allies. If you are going to be working with planets, okay, all planets have something they like to do. And we are familiar with this in astrology. We're going to talk about it on the next screen. They have a telos. Telos is a word from Aristotle. The idea that everything has a purpose. It has a direction towards which it's moving. This is why the planets were so magical and mysterious. If you look up in the sky, the stars aren't moving, but the planets are. They clearly have something they want. That's why they're moving with that telos. And so the idea with astral magic is to choose the planets who already want to do what you want to do. Makes a happy marriage. Just like if you pick friends who are interested in the same kinds of things you're interested in, you're going to have much more fun together. And so when you are choosing to make an astrological talisman, what you're going to choose to do, depending on what the talisman is for. If you want to make a talisman for wealth, you're going to work with planets that like wealth. And if you want to make a talisman for getting up and getting something accomplished in your world, you're going to want to work with planets who want to get up and get something accomplished in the world. Okay? So here are some planetary telos highlights. You should be familiar with these concepts if you are a practicing astrologer. You may not have thought about it this way before, but you are certainly familiar with all the keywords for the different planets. So if you have decisions you need to make, or you're trying to improve your sense of vitality, or you need healing, or you need purification, try talking with the sun. Sun likes to do those kinds of things. Just like whenever you have, the examples of the sick room where someone is recuperating and they're trying to get back to health, they, at least not too terribly long ago, they'd send people outside to sit in the sun and get some sunlight, or open all the windows in the house and blow in some fresh air, or hang the laundry out to get it aired out and let the sun kill all the bacteria. It has a purifying and healing element to it. The moon is nurturing, and it's also relaxing, and it helps you do things like sleep. It's also very protective. It's very protective of the earth. It keeps stuff away from us because it collects up asteroids and things. It gives it a different target other than just us to hit. So it's kind of our little protective womb. Mercury likes exchange and negotiating and studies and writing and all those kinds of things. Venus is, of course, romance and attraction and pleasure. Mars is courage, action, and separation. All these things you're familiar with. Jupiter, wealth and abundance and optimism, and Saturn, discipline and grounding and setting limits. Also delaying things. I have some handouts for this class. I'm sorry you don't have them right now, but when you get a copy of the link for the recording, Enid will send you the handouts. So you'll be getting them all. All this stuff is written down in those handouts, some other ideas on how to work with planets. In addition, it also has plants, and it has stones that are related to each one of the planets and give you an idea of what corresponds to what in a traditional sense. Okay? So let's get back to that outer planet concept. This is my personal take on the outer planets. Your mileage may vary. But because the visible planets have been around in human consciousness since the time we could look up at the sky, we have really co-evolved our understanding of the metaphysical and the physical worlds with these planets. They have divided up the universe, and so that everything you see, everything you can look at, is going to be associated with one of those 7 visible planets, Sun, Moon, or the other 5 starry planets. Okay? The outer planets have been relative newcomers to human consciousness. Uranus was discovered just in 1781, and so that's only a few hundred years ago. And Neptune and Pluto even sooner than that. So this is all new to the astrological conversation, and they don't have nearly as rich of a history of working with magic. You won't see them at all in the Picatrix, which was written in the 11th century, because no one knew they existed. So they also move really, really slowly. It's difficult to use the techniques of astrological timing as easily with these planets as it is with the traditional planets, because the whole series of electional astrology was built around the traditional planets. So I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying they're not tame. They're not domesticated the way the other planets. And so if you want to invoke them, like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, you may get more than you bargained for. You may think that this is you need some transformation in your life, but there might be simpler ways of moving about change. You could work with the moon first. The moon likes changing. It's domesticated, gradual change. It works with habits. So does Saturn, for that matter. You want to get Pluto, just like go in nuclear, the nuclear option. It works sometimes, and sometimes it might get you exactly what you needed. But once you unlock them, it's hard to go back. So I just stress that I love my outer planets. I got a whole Pluto party invented a few weeks ago because I love Pluto. But you just have to treat it with caution. If you're going to work with a wild animal as your personal, your own ally, their rules are a little different than yours. And so consider that when you're doing your experiments. And as for the zodiac signs, all right, another part of astrological history, the planets were considered central to astrology, not the signs, until relatively recently. This whole sun sign astrology thing is a reasonably new invention. And so if let's say you read Shakespeare, and you talk about someone being jovial, or someone's mercurial, or there are venereal diseases, or someone is martial, these are all adjectives that are related to the planets that we even have in our language that describes people by their planetary characteristics. Anybody who listens to me for more than, 2 minutes will say, hey, that child is mercurial. And that's because I have Mercury in Virgo and it's very prominent in my chart. Some other strong planets, too, that make the mix a little different. But in essence, they would describe me as a Mercury type. Or if you have a very prominent Venus or very prominent Moon, you would be described by your planetary type, not by your astrological sign. So zodiac signs don't have as much prominence in astrological magic, except for how they relate to the elements and to the planets that are in charge of that sign. So, for example, Taurus shows up when you need to add more Venus into your chart and more Earth into your chart. Libra shows up when you need more Venus, but the air side of Venus, and so on down the list. So once you have identified your allies, then it's time to elect a time. Choose a time to do your magic. So you're trying to find a moment in time to build your talisman that resonates with what your intentions are. Okay? So if you decided you want to build a talisman, let's say you're a college student and you want to pass your exams. So you go, I think I could work with Mercury in order to have the intellectual capacity to memorize all of this stuff. And maybe Saturn to give me a little bit of discipline to stay at the books and do the studying that I need to do. So I want to make an astrological talisman that allows me to study hard, pass my exams, and I want to work with Mercury and Saturn to do it. Not surprising, Saturn and Mercury are strong in like Albert Einstein's chart. Not a strange leap there. And so when you choose a time to make that talisman to help you do your studies, you're going to look for times where you have Mercury and Saturn really prominent in the chart. Okay? So ways that you can do this, there are myriad ways. There's no right answer, but you do the best you can. No chart is going to give you all of these things simultaneously. But ways you can make a planet pronounced. Yeah, put the planet on the ascendant or put it on the midheaven. Those are a pretty powerful statement about the planet. If you have planets on your ascendant or on your midheaven, you know they're a big part of your life. If you're doing readings for someone and they have a planet on their ascendant or their midheaven, you know it's a big part of their life. Okay? I was sitting here one day about a year and a half ago when I was thinking how I would do one of these presentations, and I was like, I need to go talk to Neptune right now. Now I need to go talk to Neptune right now. And so I wandered off into my other room and sat and meditated for about a half an hour and got my little messages and wrote them all down, came back in, and I said, what is that about? Because I needed the information. It was great to have some help to do what I needed to do. And then so I pulled up a chart and I laughed when I saw that the chart had Neptune was just crossing the midheaven for where I was sitting right now. So once you start doing this kind of magic, you start getting in tune with what it feels like to work with these different planets, and they do get very pronounced and loud when they're on the ascendant or on the midheaven. You also want the planets to be in good condition. Now, this is a big part of how traditional astrology looks at the world, in the sense of how able are planets to do their business? How well can they affect change in this 3D reality? And that's what a planet in good condition is. So that's going to be a planet that's in its own sign. So you're going to see, Venus is in better condition when she is in Taurus or Libra than when she is in Scorpio or Virgo or Aries. Okay? So you want them to be happy and able to do their stuff in the world. You want them to be well received. Well received just means it's in a good and harmonious aspect with planets around it or with the dispositor of the sign that it's in. So let's say, let's use that Venus thing. Let's say Venus is in Libra. Well, that's a good example. Venus is in Cancer. Okay, so if Venus is in Cancer in the chart that you're going to choose, you want to make sure that Venus is in a good relationship with the moon, because the moon is the one who rules the sign that she's in. Okay, this is why anybody who ends up learning magic starts to get into some kind of traditional astrology, because it really helps to be able to do these kind of calculations on the fly. Planet that's ruling the house associated with your intention should also be in good condition. So if you are doing love talismans, for example, you would like the ruler of the 5th house, which has to do with love and pleasure, to be in a good state. Ruler of the 7th house, which has to do with relationships, to be in a good state. Same rules apply as the earlier thing we talked about. And if you can't get all of these things, you can do things like look for a planetary day or a planetary hour that supports your intention. So every day of the week is named for a planet. We should all know this. Sunday is Sunday, Moon Day is Monday, and so on down the list. Tuesday is Mars Day, Wednesday is Mercury Day, Thursday is Saturn Day, just in case you don't hear it in the language. You can actually hear it in Spanish and French and other languages. There are planetary, the whole days are divided up into planetary hours, and so it just starts with dawn, goes through and divides up the day, one planet at a time, 1 through 7, then 1 through 7, 1 through 7 just keeps repeating, and then we get to sunset and it just repeats the process again. There's an app for that, which is what I use, but any astrology software will also tell you. And so this was the way, if you didn't have access to charts, if you couldn't get an ephemeris and do all the math, which was a hard thing to do for much of our history. Not everybody could read or have the mathematical knowledge to be able to construct an actual chart. So they used the planetary days and the hours, at least as a guidepost. Of course, you would like the moon in good condition. It's always good to have the moon in condition. It's kind of like, go to the doctor and say, just drink more water. It's a good thing. Have more moon. Moon is always helpful for things that have to do with magic. And it moves very fast, which makes it easy to get it in a chart. And we'll talk about that in a second. I've got an example on the next page. You want to see the moon in good condition and not void. We have this kind of strange relationship to void of course moons in our modern world, because I don't think we really understand them anymore. But void of course moons was really important in magic. And the reason was this. The moon job, if you look at that hierarchy of planetary energy, if we're talking about the vertical dimension, the moon was the bottom. It was the closest thing to us. In fact, the Greeks actually called it the difference. Nature was the sublunar realm. It was everything below the moon in their philosophical vision. Well, the moon's job was as the messenger. She took all the light from all the other planets and brought it down. It's kind of like she was the talisman for all the other planets herself. And so then this is why she got associated with magic. So she would get the light from all the other planets, called translating the light, and she would pour it down, step it down into a physical reality so that it would be part of our world. So that as the moon was going by and having an aspect, seeing each one of, that's what aspect means, it means to see. Seeing each one of the planets that she'd go by, she'd take the light and she'd translate it down to the physical reality. But when she had visited, when she'd moved into a sign, made an aspect with all the planets, she was going to make one, basically she was like a letter carrier that had no mail in her bucket anymore. And so she had to wait to go back to the mail station, in other words, switch signs, to get more messages from the planets and deliver them down. So it's like a moon that has no celestial oomph to deliver to help you with the process. In essence, it would be like trying to body surf. Go out, you body surf, you catch a wave, and you ride it in. Well, if there's no wave, if you're in the trough between waves, there's no oomph There's no celestial push to get you into shore, and that's the same problem with magic. If you're trying to do magic, especially astral magic, and you're getting no oomph from the planets you want to help you, then you're not going to accomplish anything. You might be connecting and communing, but you're not making change. And that's what a void moon was, is that period of time when the letter carrier's basket was empty. And so in a modern world, we talk, well, it doesn't matter. I'll do whatever I want when the moon is void. But if you were talking about doing something magical with intention, waiting a few hours for the moon to clear gets you a little bit of more celestial oomph. And it may not matter for things that you do on a habitual basis because they're going to happen anyway, but when you're talking about working with the metaphysical, it becomes a much bigger deal. Of course, you can experiment with this on your own and see how it works out for you. Personally, I get lots of stuff done when the moon is void because no one bothers me, and I like it. But it's kind of like getting some stuff done when you're in slack time, so to speak. Excuse me. Okay? So here's an example of a time that I elected to create a Mercury talisman for myself. I believe it was Christopher Warnock who mentioned something about really strong Mercury things, and I just went back to my computer and I looked and I went, wow! Because here in Austin, Texas, this was a few years ago, you could see that Saturn was just entering Scorpio, that it was a Wednesday, Mercury day, in the Mercury hour, where here in Austin, and these kinds of charts are very sensitive to the place that you are in. Sometimes you can get a great electional chart to make a talisman in one location, but not in another location. So that's just something to think about. So hopefully all of you have enough astrology as a background to be able to read this chart. I try not to make my presentations too chart heavy because I never know who's listening in. But this is an example of the talisman chart that I did for that Mercury talisman. So it had Virgo rising, and Mercury is the ruler of Virgo. Mercury was conjunct the midheaven, so it was right up at the top. It was the highest, most elevated planet in the sky, and it was in its own sign of Gemini. So just for making a Mercury talisman, you can't get much better than Mercury day in the Mercury hour, Mercury's sign of Virgo rising, Mercury in Gemini conjunct the midheaven. It made a very, very strong Mercury. It just happened to have the benefit that Mercury was also with Venus and the Sun and Jupiter, which made it a happy party up there in Gemini. It's not quite perfect. I would have liked it better if the moon was increasing in light rather than decreasing in light, meaning that I would have liked the moon to be waxing rather than waning. And you can see here from the chart this is a waning moon. But as charts go, it's not bad. I mean, seriously, there is no such thing as perfect, as we know from our own lives, and there's no such thing as perfect in magic either, but this was a great attempt. And so, of course, we went out and we had a little Mercury party, me and my daughter, and I consecrated my Mercury talismans with the appropriate Mercury stones at the appropriate time of the day that I chose to get this little moment. And as an offering to Mercury, we went to the grocery store and my daughter suggested jelly beans, green for Mercury. And I laughed. I said, sure, we will have magic Mercury beans, which I still have a few left over in a jar, because once you offer something to a planet, once it becomes something that you are thanking the planet with, it is kind of rude to throw it away. You have to eat it. And so I've been doling out the Mercury jelly beans for a number of years now. Still eating them. And what was even more entertaining was that in this process, as a way to celebrate in the Mercury party, she grabbed my guitar. She's like, I need to play songs from Mercury. And she doesn't know how to play the guitar, which is why I thought it was so cute, because I knew that in the ancient Greek mythology, Mercury was the one who was credited, Hermes in this case, with inventing the lyre. The lyre is a musical instrument that they played in ancient Greece that is sort of the forerunner of the guitar. So I thought it was adorable that my little kid would intuit this connection as a part of just floating around in the collective unconscious or the ether, or just working with Mercury energy. That's the way it works. So once you have elected a time, of course you're going to do that in advance, because the next step in the prepping is to collect all the ingredients that you are going to need to make your talisman. Now, books like the Picatrix and Agrippa's book on magical formulas, these all have very specific drawings and materials descriptions that you can use to make talismans. That's a traditional way. But you can also use the correspondences for ingredients that are available today. You don't have to, at least in my experience, go completely traditional. Please don't shoot me for saying this. It still works just fine if you've got the correspondences aligned. And if you think about it, you know, just because they came up with something in the Middle Ages didn't necessarily mean they had that same thing even 1,000 years before that. And they were doing magic way before we had any technology of any kind. So other than, you know, flint arrowheads. So things you might want to consider when you're making your talismans: pre-made jewelry that just happens to represent the planets that you're going to be working with. It's fair game. Colored beads or stones, maybe small little bags that you fill up with herbs related to the planets. You can even make paper talismans. Being able to, I said, Christopher Warnock again advocates using the printer and printing the talisman drawing out at the appropriate auspicious moment in time and let the printer do the fabrication for you. Kind of a way of blending our modern fabrication technology with ancient wisdom. But use your imagination. Again, no one right answer. This is the art part. The electional timing has a lot of math involved, and the science part is figuring out, okay, I tried this, it didn't work. I tried this, it did work. Let's figure out which things work and which things don't. That's the science part. The art part is coming up with these recipes, just like cooking. No one is going to be absolutely right at any given time, but you have to use your imagination to figure out how it's going to work. Okay? Once you've made your plan, once you have your time and you've collected up all your ingredients, it's time to, at the appropriate time, assemble and consecrate them. The consecration is the way you align your talisman with those divine forces that you're seeking to attract in the world. So when the time is right, what you start your little ceremony by purifying and invoking. Purifying just means setting aside all the concerns and the stuff of your normal part of life and creating that sacred space by your intentions. Invoking means, hey, I'm stating I'm going to make this talisman now. Everyone who's going to come and help me, come and help me. Asking for assistance, this is where you align with the planets and the spirits of the ingredients that you're going to work with. So it could be the planets. If it's a love talisman, you're working with Venus, or it's a wealth talisman, you're working with Jupiter. It's the ingredients. Okay, you're working with a moon talisman, and you're going to create jewelry that's silver. You thank the spirits of the silver or the stones that are involved. Then you're going to make an offering to those who are helping. Kind of, again, back to if they're cleaning your garage, they at the very least should get some beer and pizza out of the deal at the end of the day. So if you're making an offering, if you're going to ask Jupiter to work for you, with you, at the very least you can burn some Jupiter incense for Jupiter's favorite herbs, which tend to be everything Christmas area. Again, all this is in the handouts for some of these specific. I just don't have time in an hour and a half to go through them all. There's also a class we taught at Kepler a couple months ago called Astral Allies. That's 3 hours on knowing the allies for each of these kinds of things, which can help you out. If you talk to Enid afterwards, I'm sure she can find you a copy. We have one around somewhere. So candles and incenses, anything that's appropriate, one of the planet's favorite things. And once you've done your offering, then you express gratitude and you say, thank you very much, this is great, let's move on now to something else. You can close the experience, kind of give it an ending, an opening and an ending. Okay? Those are the 5 steps. If you want to be advanced, consider yourself an advanced practitioner of magic. Some of you listening here are probably well versed in the concept of magic, or you have something that you're already doing in Wicca or some other form of paganism. You can also use a little bit of Reiki, if this is something that you do. There's hands-on healing techniques to energize, jazz up the whole process, kind of like giving it a turbocharge. There are exercises that help you fill your own auric space with the presence of the planet. As we mentioned this earlier, this concept of drawing down the moon into you. There are techniques for that. If you're interested, look it up. You can also charge your talismans in a dream. Sometimes you might find that the appropriate moment to make a talisman is actually in the middle of the night. I have had dreams where all this work, all this thanking and everything else was done on the dream level. It can be extremely effective. Presumes that you're used to working with your dreams and remembering your dreams and all those kinds of things. We have a class on that we taught at Kepler a few months ago too. Or working with sex magic. There's a whole practice of this that goes along with magic. It's a great way of getting a huge charge of energy in a small space. Books on that as well. You can look it up. So, other ideas for using talismans. Why in the world did you consider doing this? Well, we mentioned in the beginning that, talisman making was a part of the Western tradition because we like being in control, let's face it. And while some cultures would, if you're trying to elect a time, the most auspicious time to get married or to do something else in your life, and that time is not going to come up for a year or longer, the Western mind is like, I don't want to have to wait. I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And so talismans became a kind of intermediary step. If it's inconvenient to get married on a Tuesday, but there's a great moment on Tuesday and the weekend is terrible, you make your talisman for the marriage on the Tuesday, and then you put it, one on the bride and one on the groom, to bring the energies of that moment forward in time so that you are at least harmonizing with that auspicious occasion with the happy couple. It's kind of the logic that you're just time shifting. If you can't start your business at the absolute moment that you need to, then you go get a talisman to help bring that moment to you. If the mountain won't come to Muhammad, then, well, okay. In this case, this is more like bringing the mountain to Muhammad than Muhammad going to the mountain. But hey, it was an attempt at a metaphor. So, okay. So Enid also mentions the concept of remediation. This is the Western way of working with remediation. I'm not a big fan of the word remediation in the sense that it sounds that something is broken and you need to fix it. And nothing's really broken in this process. This is just a way of balancing out energies so that we can harmonize with our celestial influences in a much more profound way. Now, Marsilio Ficino's concept of this, he had two ways, basically, more or less. And I highly recommend his book, 3 Books on Life, especially the last one. And if you can't read through the historical version, Thomas More, who wrote Care for the Soul, also wrote a book on Ficino. It's called The Planets Within. Highly recommend that as a way to get into Ficino's work because he is writing in the 20th century is much more accessible to some people. And kind of fun to see him. He doesn't really like astrology in the book because it's not popular to like astrology in the psychology books all the time, but he clearly likes Ficino, and so it's a lovely read. So his kind of general ways, there are 2 ways of working with the planet. You can either become the avatar of that planet and wholeheartedly throw yourself into what that planet loves to do. So if it's Saturn, work all the time and set boundaries and work off your to-do lists. Or if it's Venus, indulge yourself and go Venusian crazy and all of those kinds of things. Or you have to do the complementary opposite, and you have to do the complementary opposite because we are people, not planets. And since we are not planets, you can't completely give yourself over to be Venus or to be Saturn. You have to do the opposite so you can find the balance point in between them. So if you're going to inhabit Saturn for a while and work really hard to get because you need to get a project done, you need to give yourself time to do the opposite. So if you're working really hard, it might be to go get a massage to make Venus happy. Or it might be to go for a run to make Mars happy, or something else that tempers the experience so you find that balance point. Okay? So we touched on this briefly. In order to become a planetary avatar, you have to establish a relationship with each one of the planets as part of a spiritual practice. Ultimately, this is what astrologers did back in the day. We spoke for the planets. And in order to speak for the planets, you have to have a deep personal relationship with each one of the planets. This does not mean you going, ugh, I hate Mars, he makes me too anxious, or I hate Saturn, everybody hates Saturn. No, this means every single one of the planets you start having a positive and productive relationship with, because then you have at least a respect for one another and can work with each other in order to create change in the world. To do this, one of the things you can do is create a talisman for each one of the planets. Find a good time when that planet is really strong and make a talisman, and then pull that into your life. So wear it when you want to work with a particular planet, or if the particular planet is making an aspect in your own chart, or if you need to balance it out. It's a great thing to have. There's a whole alchemical ritual about this. It's called the ritual of lesser circulation. Basically, they make a tincture out of the herbs that are related to each one of the planets, and then you take the tincture of that planet on that particular day of the week to sensitize yourself to what it feels like to be that planet. I know I used to, way back when, close to 20 years now, I decided I wanted to connect with each one of the planets by wearing the color of that planet every day of the week. So on Monday I would wear moon colors, and Tuesday I would wear Mars colors, and so on, and just to see what it felt like. And I didn't realize at the time that people had done this already. I thought it was like inventing some new thing. But you know, when you're 20, you always think you're inventing something new that no one has done before. There are still astrologers today who wear the color of the planets. If you're at an astrological conference, you kind of know who's doing this kind of thing, because they'll all show up wearing the planetary color on the appropriate day at the astrological conference. Some astrologers are not so forward about the whole thing, and they have like sets of underwear that match the planetary colors for each day, so they're just wearing the color underwear of the planet. Someday someone's going to come to a conference and they're going to design a whole line of planetary underoos, and they're going to sell it, and I will laugh so hard because it's so perfect. It gives us a chance to like express our planetary energies in private, so to speak. Okay, so this is something that you can do, is also to, when a planet is transiting in some place in your chart, it's right with the sun, or it's in the first house, or some other place that it's prominent, you can get to know the planet as like a house guest, and you're living with that planetary energy in a more concentrated way. You get to know of its whims rather than kicking at it so hard when it will just be a surly guest, as opposed to when it can be a productive force that you get to work with in your life. Okay, the principle of complementarity. This is the other side of doing the complementary opposite. So this is when you identify temperament. You've got too much of something or too little of something. So the idea is just like a teeter-totter. If you've got too much of something, you have to balance it out by hitting the other side and increase what's missing. There's no right answer. There's the art part is in figuring out how to balance and shift, and it might change from moment to moment. So all you can do is experiment, experiment, experiment. Because you're trying to find some kind of neutral buoyancy. That's actually me in diving. When you learn how to do some underwater diving, you realize that how you breathe, if you've got the weight belt sorted out properly, you breathe in a little bit, you're going to raise up. You breathe out a little bit, you're going to sink down. That sort of being able to manage your own internal energy levels with the planets in this process is what you're going for. And so you can use your talismans as a counterbalance. So if you're feeling too flighty, you can go get some Saturn talismans to pull yourself in. If you're feeling too serious, you can get some Venus talisman to lighten yourself up a little bit. If you've got a lack of energy or spirit, go get the sun. If you need courage, let's get some Mars talismans in your life. So it just depends on what you are coping with at a particular point in time. A couple of examples on how to use them with transiting influences. So let's say you have Saturn transiting across your ascendant. You can learn to be the planetary avatar of Saturn. So you can work really, really hard, or get all the foundational stuff and all the stuff you don't want to do, check it off your to-do list, because that will make Saturn happy. You're, in essence, working with Saturn. But you also need to do the complementary opposite, so you don't get so mired in Saturn that you become depressed, or too cold, or have some bone issues because Saturn's been overemphasized. And the complementary opposite in the case of working really hard might be, I said, making time for pleasure, or going for a run, or something else. Okay, so it's an example of Neptune. You can also harmonize with the outer planets. A little more complicated. So let's say Neptune is transiting opposite your sun. You can learn to accept what Neptune represents and what you can't control. Neptune likes that. Believe me, I've had so many Neptune transits in the last few years. I feel like I'm the underwater goddess at this point in time. Or you can strengthen the sun to withstand all of that Neptune influence. So this might be doing things that help improve your vitality and your energy, so you don't have it all feel like it's completely dissolved away in the Neptune experience. So another way to use a talisman, wear around like a sun talisman in this case to help you balance out those heavy Neptunian energies. Okay? So here's another concrete example. You can make talismans for your clients, or you can teach your clients how to make them themselves. It just depends on how your practice works. So here's an example a lot of people work with, but you know, this comes in many forms. This is just a wedding example. So what if you're asked to choose a date for a wedding and all the dates provided by the happy couple are terrible, at least from your point of view, and you would like to help them correct this imbalance? Well, one thing you can do is create a talisman that balances out the issues that are with the wedding chart. And you can have them wear that on the day. And one way to do it might be to actually make a talisman using some traditional methods out of jewelry, or have it cast professionally. This could be a wedding gift, really. Or what I've done for people is like hand draw charts, and put the appropriate colors that balance out the chart, and let someone, a lot of times it's a parent or a sibling or something that wants to give this as a wedding present. And since we have the date ahead of time, I don't necessarily say anything. I say, because they're making a chart of the wedding, but I just use all of the colors and things that help balance that out in the drawing that I do for the chart. But there's a lot of different ways to do this, and it depends on how open the people you're working with are to do these kinds of things. But it's surprising, most people think it's really cool when I work with them. So what next? What can you do with this fun idea when we have like 10 minutes left? In conclusion, I said at the beginning, destiny can't be broken. These transits are going to happen. Your chart is the way it is. But you can bend it a bit so that you can find the most harmonious expression of different planets at different times. So by working intelligently with these cosmic forces, you can find ways to promote balance and harmony. And the logical conclusion of this is anytime you look at a chart, it is, in essence, a talisman. It may not be a talisman designed for a specific thing other than the person's life that you're working with. But we are kind of talismans that are all interacting with one another. I may have a super duper strong Mercury influence in my chart with some Jupiter and Moon and some other things on the side. So that for me, for when I'm around, it makes everything more mercurial because that's what I'm resonating with. Okay? I have a friend who's got Uranus right on the midheaven. He's a Uranian talisman. And he knows it. Wherever he goes, he's got some Uranus into the mix going on. And all people are like that. And some of us are much more nuanced mixtures, but if you've got all your planets in one place and one planet's really strong, you are exhibiting the effects of that planet, in a sense. Talismans today, these are a couple pictures I took at Norwalk when I was walking around. Enid, who's on the call, you know, she makes some gorgeous talismans of her own. Hopefully we'll have a couple minutes at the end to ask her any questions too. But we are doing this in astrological conferences. We may not call it that, but we are, in essence, making talismans of our own. In the words of Joseph Crane, I'm a modern astrologer, but heavily traditionally influenced. I use the outer planets. I live in a modern age. And I actually started with evolutionary astrology and switched into traditional astrology. So I would, if you start doing this kind of magic, and this is an excellent question, whoever asked it, brilliant, spot on. All of the magical texts are written from the point of view of using whole sign houses, or at least it makes it a lot easier to use whole sign houses when you are doing your magical calculations, because the house then equals the sign, and it goes around that way. Now, I'm not saying that they will not work if you were using some other house system. You are just going to have to experiment to figure out how they work differently, especially if you're trying to get the ruler of that planet to be in charge.
Right.
So this is whole sign houses. So the midheaven can be in the 9th, it can be in the 10th, it can be in the 11th, it can be in the 12th. It moves around. In this case, it actually, you know, it's Mercury still with the midheaven. It wouldn't matter what chart system you were using. Mercury would be with the midheaven, and it would be in the 10th house if you were using Placidus. It would just put the other stuff, because it's on the other side of the midheaven, in the 9th house. Okay, does that make sense?
Right. And if you'll notice, it's just there's so many planets in Gemini that it spreads it takes that whole part of fortune, Sun, Jupiter, Venus, midheaven, Mercury. They're all in Gemini, and they just didn't have room enough. It's a little confusing to just see, but the 10th house cusp in a whole sign system is not the same, usually, as the midheaven. The midheaven can land anywhere up there, depending on where you live.
So this is something that you're going to run in if you actually go and start doing research in some of the older texts for doing astrological magic. They're not going to be relying on plastic. Sometimes they do, they use reg, the diamantus. You're going to have to experiment to see how your mileage may vary. But a planet with the midheaven or the ascendant is going to be with the midheaven or the ascendant regardless of what house system you use.
Another person asked, is there a lecture you can listen to find more information specifically on how to make talismans?
Well, we talked about it a lot more in my Astral Magic class. Enid and I have talked about this before. Some things are easier to do in person than than online. And I don't know. Enid makes talismans, so we'll have to put our little brains together to figure out if that's even possible to do online.
Video. We'll have to just do some video. I think that's about the only way for online.
That would be a first. That would be a first. But it's doable. Hey, I got a camera. You got a camera. You can figure it out.
You can figure it out.
Give us a challenge. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, Christopher Warnock may have something, because that's his pretty much his whole astrological what he does for his living is talisman.
A friend of Russ's, Tony Mack, he's online. He also makes these gorgeous traditional talismans as well. I mean, I feel like the bad boy of magic because I make based on, on logic. I don't just completely make stuff up, but I also, as Chris Warnock once said, he's like, oh, you're the type who uses roller skates for a Mercury talisman, aren't you? And I said, yeah, because wouldn't Mercury like roller skates? I mean, of course he would.
Winged Mercury, yeah, he'd go for roller skates, that's for sure. But that also brings up a really good point. Some of this tradition, it wasn't automatic. They were using what they had and what their culture had. And your comment on intention is so important, because in many ways the magic doesn't depend on the material as much as it depends on the intention and really thoughtful consideration of how you are using. So yeah, printing a talisman off on the printer works.
and if you think about it, you can't just say, well, planets don't like stuff of modern life. I mean, the idea of astrology was really about correspondences, and that the planets each represented a realm of their favorite things, and that realm didn't just stop of things that were invented after 1500 are no longer planetary alliesable because they can't be, because planets don't like them anymore. I'm like, that's ridiculous. Of course they like them. And so you don't think Mercury likes computers? I mean, he's telling you the ultimate information age is a mercurial invention. Perfectly happy, and that's why Mercury retrogrades are such a big deal for us now, because we live in an information age. It's all about Mercury. And so when Mercury goes on vacation and is sipping chocotinis somewhere and taking a break, we are more sensitive to it than we may have been at some other point in time when it wasn't such an issue in our lives. And it's just stuff like that that comes up, and we don't, it doesn't make any sense to me. And it may have just been, again, the way I was taught and the way I experience my life. I talk to my planets now. They don't seem to be functioning less simply because I'm a modern person. They speak in modern language.
Barbara has a great comment on that. It's the person who was the magi, not the stuff. That's a very good way to put it. And there is also a recommendation here, is Israeli Regarde, how to make and use talismans. Got some good advice on the paper talismans.
Yeah, he's got one. I have links for all of these things in the handouts. You might also enjoy Isaac Bonowitz. He wrote Real Magic. That's a good one. That's modern and accessible. Yeah, I've got some of this. If you are interested in doing background research, you'll get a little reference list, because I read a lot. And again, I've got cheat sheet handouts that have got some correspondences. So it's like Mercury stones are these, Mercury herbs are these, Mercury people are these, and so on down the list. So you can sort of brainstorm your own ideas for each one of the planets. And I actually teach my beginning astrology classes like this because I think it's easier to broaden out our understanding of the planets rather than just relying on psychological keywords, because you really do start to see the fact that we live in an astrological universe, in a sense. Everything resonates with everything else, not just the ideas that we have in our head. It also makes it easier to talk about astrology in the context of mundane events, because you realize how quickly the planetary energies bleed off into other areas, such as what we physically look like, or cycles that are happening in the world, because it's that correspondence that we're working with.
When you start to do that, too, you start to realize that for as much as the scientific revolution put the talk of astrology to the background, it's embedded everywhere.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
it really is.
Everywhere.
Really, really is. And so I had fun putting together this class, because these are things I take for granted. So if I skipped over things or I went too fast, please forgive me. I really did learn all this stuff before I got completely embedded in astrology. And so it's been fun for me to blend all that knowledge that I got. I mean, I spent 10 years working in a shamanic tradition, and I spent another 5 doing some pretty hardcore hermetic magic. So it was a pleasure for me to come back to some of this stuff from an astrological context, because I went, wow, there really is a connection here that I missed just reading my first couple of astrology books, and it's really fun to be able to present that to people.
The advantage of the course is that you have 5 weeks to go play with this, and
yes,
you'll have a setup so that people can also discuss in between the live sessions of the class. So, as you know,
yes, we have a classroom space. You can actually experiment, and I can't stress experimenting enough in this process. If you don't do it yourself and see how it actually works in your life and make tweaks based on your own experience, you're losing the whole rationale of being that divine scientist of your own life. And you know, we're supposed to be living and improving ourselves through the process. That's what magic is about. It's not just about, I command you to do this thing I want. It's about changing yourself to make things happen.